89.3 and 88.5 Yes FM. Online at www.yeshome.com. Now on the free Yes FM iTunes app and the Yes FM Android app, or the free TuneIn Radio app. Search Yes FM Lima.
We are joined by Colin Duriez. He is the author of the A-Z of C.S. Lewis, an encyclopedia of his life, thought, and writings. Colin, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you, Tommy. I'm very pleased to be on it.
We're glad to have you joining us from the Lake District over there in England. So we're glad to have you. Now, what time? It's later in the day for you, is it not?
Yeah, it's just after lunchtime. It's about nearly 10 to 1. Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you joining us here this morning. And C.S. Lewis is a favorite among Christians for his writings, of course, most famously for the Chronicles of Narnia and that whole series. But a man of a really towering intellect. A great scholar, a medieval scholar, and wrote a lot of things beyond just the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Chronicles of Narnia series that people may not be as familiar with.
That's right. Yes, he was a combination of scholar and storyteller, and the range of his books was enormous. Which is why I wrote the A to Z guide, actually, to encourage people to explore and find new paths in his work, because you can follow many directions, which is why I did an A to Z, so that it's a familiar format and you can start anywhere you want. You could start with Z or A or somewhere in the middle, Narnia, or find out about his other writings or his friends.
And I remember one of my favorite books of his is not a fiction book at all. It's a series of lectures he gave called The Abolition of Man, which was ostensibly about education, but really about a lot more. And it seems like a lot of his writings, that's the case. It starts out, it's kind of like about one thing, but when you dive into it, you find out it's about a whole lot more.
Yes, his writings actually take you into a world, don't they? One of the earliest books on C.S. Lewis was called The Christian World of C.S. Lewis, and that was the first study of him that I read, and I thought that was a very good title, because that's exactly what it is. It's a world with seen through a Christian vision, and full of life and unexpectedness, not the usual things that you would expect. Lots of angles on things. Christ portrayed somewhat as a lion, etc.
Do you have a particular favorite of his writings?
I do. I've got my favorite fiction book is probably Perelandra, which is the second of his 3 science fiction stories set on the planet Venus, which in his scheme of things is an inhabitable planet, and it has an equivalent of a new human race with green skin, and very, very wonderfully portrayed planet. And the other book that I very much like, non-fiction, is his book Miracles, because it goes right to the heart of one of the issues of our day, which is we tend to be surrounded by a very strong materialism, where the idea is that all that you can know is what is through your senses, and there's nothing beyond that, really. He talks about the supernatural world and how it relates to the world that we see. It's so much in it.
Do you think that, because I know in his early life he was an atheist before he came to faith, talk about how that maybe informed his writing on things like miracles and other things that maybe informed his own faith later on in his life?
Well, I think the stages as being an atheist was very important. It wasn't really until halfway through his life that he became a Christian believer, and I think because of so many years as an atheist, and then later on searching, acknowledging that there was some kind of God before he became a Christian believer, I think it helped him to know from the inside what it was like to see the world in a very different way, a materialistic way, and how empty it was, and I think it helped him to communicate because of that to people that were outside of the church, and I think that was where his heart was. He did have many people who wrote to him who were believers, but I think he was concerned with the number that weren't, that were what he called post-Christian, that had very little knowledge of what Christian belief was all about.
What are some of the themes that kind of keep popping up? Because it seems like any writer, there generally are just a couple of themes that always seem to crop up in their writing. What were some of the themes that he kept returning to in his writings?
Well, one of them actually is the presence of God in reality, in every respect, and that's strongest perhaps in the Narnian stories, where you have an equivalent in the talking lion Aslan, who is the creator of Narnia, and he's portrayed in that world that he's made. But there's many other themes as well. One of my favorites is what he called undeception, the process of becoming undeceived and suddenly seeing things in a new way. And this comes out in many of his stories, and he actually got the idea to some extent from the writings of Jane Austen, where there's this feature in her novels, and I think that's very strong both in Narnia stories for children and also in his adult stories. And really, what he was trying to do in all his writings was to help people to see the world in a new way, to what he called going past the watchful dragons that protect us from changing our minds or seeing things. He very much saw reality as a struggle between the powers of darkness and light, and he wanted to do what he could to help people to be undeceived, rather like Jesus did when in telling his parables. He got past people's barriers by telling these stories.
And he was part of that now famous group, the Inklings, along with J.R.R. Tolkien and Charles Williams and others. What influence did that group have on him and his writing?
Well, it was just initially quite a small group of his friends. They were marked by the fact that they were Christians of some sort and also wanting to write. And if you look at just two of them as an example, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, they both had an enormous impact upon each other, so much so that without their friendship, I'm convinced you would have had neither the Chronicles of Narnia nor the Lord of the Rings. Both owed so much to each other on that. And then there's other friends like Charles Williams, who joined the group at the beginning of World War II, and he was a very, very big influence on C.S. Lewis and his writings. And he helped Lewis to see lots of things in a new way, even though he thought so much out.
Yeah, a guy not perhaps as well known as C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, but an interesting writer in his own right.
Yes.
We're talking with Colin Duriez. He is the author of the A-Z of C.S. Lewis, an Encyclopedia of His Life, Thought, and Writings. And basically, I mean, it is really an encyclopedia-like. You can look up just about any topic that will come up or any character that will come up in his writings, and you can find a brief write-up there of what it's about. Why did you want to write this book, and in this way? What do you hope that people would draw out of it?
Well, my main purpose was to introduce people who didn't know much about C.S. Lewis into the broader range of his thought and writings, imagination, and also for people who had read some of his work, for example, Narnia stories, or maybe one of the science fiction stories, or at least knew something. Maybe they'd seen the film Shadowlands or the Narnia movies. But the idea was to help people to explore, because everybody's familiar with the A to Z format, the encyclopedia format, and so you can take your own route through it. You can look up an article about a character you want to find out about more, say Aslan, and then I've got a system of asterisks to lead people onto other places, a bit like a hyperlink if it was on the computer. So some pages look like they got measles because they got
all the little asterisks there to tell you where you can find other references. And I like the fact that it's not just like characters in the book and things, but you include themes like you have a long section on myth and how he uses myth and what he means when he says myth. Because sometimes I think we hear myth and we think, oh, it's a made-up story. But that's not how he used myth, is it?
No, not at all. He was using it to some extent by what we would call a worldview, but not worldview seen only as intellectual ideas, but worldview is seen as the whole imaginative background of the way that we see the world and different ages see the world. And so myth is very much related to beliefs about the real world. But it's essentially that it's got a story form, a narrative that grips people's on a deeper level than just the intellectual level, though of course Lewis regarded the intellectual as very important. But there's all kinds of other levels going on in people's beliefs and in myths and stories that people tell each other that shape their lives.
How much of that was influenced by his professional work as a scholar at Oxford and a scholar of the Middle Ages? How much of that, because I don't think we necessarily think about that sometimes when we think about his work and how he would be influenced by that.
Well, he was his scholarly work was very much a part of what made him tick. But like his friend Tolkien, he was a scholar of the Middle Ages, which is a huge period of human history, which was dominated by Christian belief, and it had a rich both philosophical stream and literature and the arts, music, all kinds of things going on, and he was very familiar with this. And in fact, you find a lot of his scholarly background in his stories, in the Narnian stories, for example, which are written to the level of the child. They have an enormous amount of insight and imagination from the medieval period. That period, he wanted people to know about it in a kind of friendly kind of way, so that they could enrich our lives today by having that perspective.
And I do think that's one of his great assets as a writer, his great talents as a writer, is taking, sometimes pretty lofty ideas and then bringing them, communicating them in a very accessible way.
Yes, that's right. Somebody once said that he made righteousness readable. And, that's a good phrase, good way of putting it. And people, it's amazing. A book like Screwtape Letters, which is about it's letters between a senior devil to a junior devil on how to make sure that somebody ended up in hell. Which Lewis writes it as an amusing book, even though it's a serious subject. But it's a book that people enjoy, even if they're not Christian believers, because it's got so much insight into human makeup and what we do when we, everybody's aware of doing things wrong and not being able to live the good life, the good life that they would want to live in their relationships and everything. And that book strikes a chord with people even today.
We're talking with Colin Duriez. He is the author of the book The A-Z of C.S. Lewis, an Encyclopedia of His Life, Thought, and Writings. Colin, if folks want to find out more information about the book or other books you've written, how can they do so?
Well, the simplest way is if you Google me, because I've got an unusual name, so I don't think there's anybody else with my name in the universe at the moment, at least not accessible by Google very easily. So as long as people get their heads around the spelling of my surname, and I've got a website which that'll lead you to as well. And if you go into a bookshop, they should be able to order the book for me, the book for you, if they haven't got it already, PhD or other books that I've written.
Yeah, just for the folks who know, his last name, Duriez, is D-U-R-I-E-Z, Duriez. Colin, hey, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed speaking with you, Tommy.
Yes, FM.